want to have a podcast, but you don't want to have podcast guests. In that scenario, you're going to want to have a solo podcast similar to the one I'm doing today, where it's just myself and it's not going to be anyone else. So, in this scenario, how do you engage an audience if you're not going to have podcast guests? So many of the podcasts that are out there, they do have podcast guests, similar to our podcast, REI Marketing Secrets, or if you're watching on YouTube or on our YouTube channel. What I do for our show, and I find it's nice, and what I personally recommend, or what I find is best for me, and again, it's going to be up to you, but I like to interview one guest a week. And by interviewing this guest during the week, I just like to dive into the business, what they're doing, how they're successful, how they made it work. I find just from an intriguing standpoint, that's what I want to do. That's for me. That's what I want to understand. And that's going to be helpful for our audience. But how can I also provide more content for our audience and just be direct with them? And that's by having these solo episodes where I get to really connect with the podcast audience and our podcast audience or our YouTube audience, like you are here today. Where when I'm interviewing people on my podcast, I might talk for a minute or two at the most, and then I ask a question or we go back and forth with the podcast guest. But that doesn't really get the podcast audience to know more about me and my story. So how do I engage the audience if I'm not going to be having these podcast guests? And to be honest, it wasn't easy in the beginning. It wasn't something I had normally done. I had always had podcast guests on my show, whether it's the show that we have going on now or whether it's the podcast I had back in 2015, trying to figure out different things and trying to figure out what was going to work for me. I found the first tip I would say to give you is I like to be straightforward. And what I mean by that is when I hop onto the podcast episode, I just want to dive right into it. I want to dive right into the topic and just be straightforward. I find that just works best for me, not talking around and just beating around the bush, just hopping right into it, just going right into the episode. I find that I like that aspect of it, of being a solo host. Now, once you have that aspect of it into it, okay, I get that. I hop onto the podcast. I just get right into it. Now, what's going to be next? Well, you're going to want to plan your episodes. And there's a tool that I use called Answer the Public. I paid for the lifetime access content to it. I think it was about $100, maybe $99 for it. And I could type in like podcast guesting, podcasting, and I can see all the different types of things that people are asking out there. And I can see like, oh, as an example for like today's video and podcast, someone asked, how do I engage an audience without podcast guests? And I thought to myself, well, I have an audience without podcast guests. Why not go and create a piece of content to share out there? So I want to plan my episodes. So I typically, well, at the beginning of the month, I'll plan for the entire month worth of episodes. So that way I'm always staying ahead of where I need to be. And that's a great tool. So instead of me just hopping onto the podcast and trying to think about what to talk about, I need to have some sort of plan in place for when I'm going out there and doing these podcast interviews. And when I'm planning them, I don't have anything set down whether I want the podcast to be 5 minutes, to be 10 minutes, to be 15 minutes, to be 20 minutes. It's as long as it is going to be. Whether the podcast solo episode is going to be 3, 4, 5 minutes, and that's all I need to get my point across, or I have a ton to share, a lot I want to get across, and it takes 15 to 20 minutes. So I don't put an agenda on it. I need to get this done in 5 minutes. I need to make this go at least 20 minutes. That's not how I want to operate. I just want to hop on, talk about what needs to be talked about, and just do it in the best concise possible way so that the audience can get the most beneficial information from me, from our company, as quickly as possible without wasting any other time. And that comes from planning my episodes. And this goes without saying, I like to share stories. I like to share insights when I'm doing these solo episodes. Yeah, I want it to be informative, but I want to share the reasoning behind it. One of the reasons I wanted to do these solo episodes is I just enjoy talking about podcasting, where when I'm having these podcast guests on our show, it's more talking about them, what they've accomplished, what they're doing, and less about me and our company and what I'm seeing in the podcasting space. So it just makes it a little bit trickier. And even when I'm going out there and being a podcast guest on people's podcasts, yeah, I get to talk about the company and what we do, but I don't get to talk about, hey, here's how you should engage an audience without podcast guests. Hey, here's how you should create, social media clips from your podcast interviews, yeah, I could go over it briefly, but I don't want to be sitting there as a podcast guest talking 5, 7, 8 minutes when the podcast host is just sitting there. I want my answers to be, 2 to 3 minutes at the most. Keep it very conversational. Don't go on too long. Where right now, I'm hosting these solo episodes. I don't mind if I go 8 to 10 minutes because I'm really going in depth in these topics. That's part of the reason I really do enjoy doing these solo episodes. I think it just gives me a volume to go out there and to speak and to just grow the audience, where it's just me, it's the audience, it's a microphone, and that's really all I need. But I hope that was helpful, and those are really the 3 steps on how to engage an audience without podcast guests. Again, just be straightforward when you hop onto the mic. Just get into it unless you have something very important to share. Plan your episodes. I use a tool called Answer the Public. I highly recommend it. It's really not that expensive. And then just share personal stories and insights. People want to hear about your reasoning why behind something and not just the reason for it. But I hope that was very helpful. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you're listening to it on the podcast, I hope you enjoyed today's episode.